I started making my way down to the gangways that led to various ships attached to the station, but a vibrating at my side pulled my attention away. I held up my watch to have a look, and it told me I was going in the wrong direction. What the shit? I wondered. Attention. Please head to Shuttle Bay 47. Son of a bitch, I said, squeezing my eyes shut and rubbing at my temples, which didn't do wonders for my situation, because there was a scowling Livisk waiting for me there, and when I opened my eyes again the world was spinning all around me. Not the greatest state to be in. Apparently, I'd had a little more than I anticipated. I turned back to my quarters to rectify that situation. It'd be easy enough to take a couple of hangover pills. Not to get rid of a hangover like one would expect with a name like that, but rather to purge the alcohol from your system and get to the hangover phase a little faster. I'd have to go down to whatever passed for a medbay on my new ship and try to finagle and drip out of whoever was running the place. It was an ancient solution to something modern medicine still hadn't come up with a better solution to, which was odd considering how many people in the fleet, both the Terran fleet and the combined corporate fleets, drank like fishes to deal with the stress of everything they were dealing with on the regular. Off duty, of course. Though I wondered if I'd run into some people who thought sneaking a nip was okay on duty once I got to a picket ship. I sighed when the door didn't open for me. I put my hand against the panel on the side, but even that wasn't enough to let me in. Error. Ownership of your quarters has been reassigned to the general pool. Unable to enter. I sighed again. Son of a bitch. Well, okay then. It looked like I was going to have to do a little bit of raw dogging reality until I got to my assignment. Damn it. I squeezed my eyes shut again. I found myself staring at a beautiful face that was frowning right back at me. Felt like that face was far in the distance though. Like I could almost sense where she was. But it was so far away that it didn't matter. Besides, I could point towards any general arc of the galaxy and there was a good chance she'd be in it considering how fucking big space was. I thought about what Simon told me back at Carter's bar. All that bullshit about how there was some sort of psychic connection. I wondered if a psychic connection even had to worry about something like the speed of light when communicating across the galaxy. The Livisk ascendancy was a big empire, which was part of the reason why we'd bumped up against them when we started expanding out into the stars on our own. I opened my eyes and very deliberately didn't shake my head to try and banish that vision from my head. That would only result in the hallway spinning around me some more, and that was the last thing I needed. Instead, I started towards Shuttle Bay 47, which was as simple as getting onto the lift in this part of the station. Shuttle Bay 47, I said, and then I leaned back against the lift wall and didn't close my eyes. The way the lights moved as various parts of the massive space station in Earth orbit flew past me was disconcerting. But it was a whole hell of a lot better than staring at a Livisk who'd apparently taken up residence inside my head despite not asking me if that was something I was interested in. Damn it. A couple of people got on at some point, but I ignored them. One of them gave me an odd look. No doubt the railroad special was still obvious on my breath, but I was beyond caring. Plus they were a lower rank than me, for all that rank was a little looser in the CCF, something that was a little more wibbly-wobbly depending on how you looked at it. Jax having the kind of influence that kept him out of trouble despite pulling a boneheaded move that almost resulted in the loss of a fleet was proof enough of just how screwed up things could get in the CCF. Finally, the lift opened on Shuttle Bay 47. Though to call it a shuttle bay was really a misnomer. That was the kind of term that brought to mind the shuttle bay back on my old ship, which could maybe handle a couple of shuttles meant for ferrying people back and forth in a world that unfortunately hadn't been able to build transporters to give people an easy and narratively convenient way to get places quickly. Shuttle Bay 47 was on a different level entirely. Hundreds of shuttles were laid out on multiple levels coming and going. It made my head spin. It would make a mortal space traffic controller's head spin. Thankfully, everything was controlled by computer routines that mostly kept people from crashing into each other. Hey, it was the CCF. They were getting their shuttle traffic control routines from the lowest bidder, then screwing those lowest bidders over when it came to actually servicing the stuff they installed. Which meant a lot of systems were woefully out of date, but it was cheaper to have the occasional shuttle crash than it was to actually update the software and try to go through all the legacy code. At least that was the terrifying situation an engineer on a ship I'd served on back in my days as a lieutenant commander had told me about. I wasn't sure how much of that was true and how much of it was conspiracy theory, but the idea of cutting costs because they'd rather pay out to the occasional next of kin than pay for an expensive software update was the sort of thing that sounded right on point for the combined corporate fleets. Blue lines appeared on the floor, showing me where I needed to go. I followed the line until I eventually came to Connors, who looked like something the cat dragged in. "You look like shit," I said. "You smell like shit," she said, turning her baleful glare on me. I wasn't sure if that baleful glare was because she was still blaming me for this situation, a proposal I roundly rejected since I didn't think any of this was my fault, or if it was because she clearly had the time and forethought to take a hangover pill before she came down here. "I told you not to drink so much," I said. "Did you?" she groused. "I don't remember hearing anything like that. Probably because you were already 3 sheets to the wind by the time I told you it was a bad idea," I said with a shrug. "Shut the fuck up. You talk to your commanding officer like that?" I said with a grin. She managed to hit me with a smile. It was a small smile, but it was better than the baleful glare. A shuttle came in and landed next to us, and we stepped on board. It was a small thing with a bubble canopy that gave us a nice view of the station all around us. There was a time when that sort of view would have impressed the shit out of me. Back in my academy days. Back when I was a young man and the idea of going out into space, or even working on a space station, still impressed me. These days, it was Tuesday, even though it was a Friday, I think. It could be hard keeping track of what standard day it was out in space, considering they couldn't even keep track of what day it was depending on what side of the dateline you were on down on Earth. Bureaucratic mentality is the only constant in the universe, Connors said as we lifted off and headed out into the vacuum of space. There was a brief hum as we passed through the atmosphere barrier that kept all the breathable air inside the shuttle bay. Much more convenient than having to depressurize the whole damn bay and open up mechanical doors every time you wanted to go out into the vacuum where they stored some ships. "We're probably going to get a freighter," I said, paraphrasing the back and forth that had started with ring knockers graduating from the Terran Fleet Academy so many centuries ago and had become a call and response that was set in stone. Sure, you could have a variation on the words, but it was something that was comforting in that moment. Even though we were far from knocking our rings. I looked down to my finger where I still wore my own academy ring. I sighed as I thought about the good old days. I wondered why I still wore the damn thing sometimes. Especially when everything the academy taught me led to getting drummed out of the service and put in my current situation. I pushed those thoughts away as we moved out among various ships. There were massive battle cruisers and carriers all around us. Impressive to look at even if we weren't getting close to those babies. Not that I wanted to be on a carrier. I'd been in fast movers since my academy days. Though the idea of popping out of fold space in one of those babies and launching a bunch of fighters that could really fuck up your enemy's day was an interesting one. It turns out small fighter craft were a whole hell of a lot more practical when you took fold space combat into account. Sometimes the fighter jocks would pull up ancient discussions from the ancient internet about how space fighters weren't practical and have competitions to see who could get the farthest without laughing. "We're going for an awful long while," Connors muttered as we just kept going. "Yeah. Tell me about it," I muttered back. "But what do you expect? We're not getting any of the shiny new toys. The old busted toys are farther out." "Yeah, I know," she said with a sigh. We moved out past the cruisers. I looked at them with a wistful sigh. I'd been on a cruiser, and she'd been shot out from under me and boarded. Sure, I'd managed to save the situation, But even getting into that situation in the first place was enough to get me kicked downstairs. Especially when there was a steady stream of potential COs from the actual Terran fleet who were looking to retire from the real military and get the slightly better pay and retirement package that went with working for the combined corporate fleets. Finally, we moved out to the scout ships. Even that would be better than a picket ship. I let out a sigh. At least it's not a freighter, Connors muttered. I'd almost hope for a freighter compared to a picket ship, I said. At least then you get to go to interesting ports, right? As you say, Captain, she said, still doing a variation on the ancient call and response. Finally, we crested a rather large Wanderer-class scout ship. Those babies were designed for missions out in deep space. If we were on one of those, then it might actually involve some exploring of strange new worlds. Though the only civilization we'd be seeking out were the Livisk, and we'd be calling in fleets to blow them out of the stars. But it wasn't to be. We had our assignment. We crested over the Wanderer-class ships to a bank of much smaller Watcher-class. Ships meant to serve as an early warning while also providing a place for the CCF to put people whose careers were over but they couldn't quite justify kicking them out. And we were heading right for one of them. They only had a crew of about 50 people, which wasn't all that much while still being way too much for the mission. See above about being glorified places for people who couldn't be trusted with real duty to mark time until retirement. My friend, I said, shaking my head as I exchanged a glance with Connors. We've come home. Neither one of us looked very happy about that.